think cowboys simply rode off into the sunset or died in a dusty shootout, but many faced a fate far slower and more agonizing in the territorial prisons of the Old West. While the open range offered endless freedom, the moment the iron gates clicked shut, that world vanished, replaced by a brutal engineering of human suffering that modern minds can barely grasp. Here is the thing about frontier justice that sounds completely backwards. Surviving the capture was often the easy part, while the four walls of a desert cell were specifically designed to break your body and spirit long before you ever reached a gallows. The environment of a desert prison like Yuma or Huntsville was literally everywhere around you. But just like seawater to a pirate, the desert sun was your greatest enemy. You might be surrounded by vast, open space, but inside a stone cell, the heat became a physical weight that pressed against your lungs until you felt like you were breathing liquid fire. The temperature inside these stone ovens could reach a staggering 110 degrees, far higher than what the human brain is designed to withstand without permanent neurological damage. When the sun beat down on those thick granite walls, they acted like thermal batteries, soaking up the radiation all day and releasing it slowly through the night. The salt content in a pirate's water was a nightmare, but for a cowboy in a territorial cell, the nightmare was the absolute lack of air circulation. Cells were basically stone boxes with tiny slits for windows, and as the day progressed, the oxygen would deplete, while the humidity from human sweat climbed to suffocating levels. Your body would desperately try to cool itself by pumping blood to the skin's surface, but with no breeze to evaporate the moisture, your internal temperature would continue to rise. It was like being trapped inside a slow cooker, where the very act of sitting still required the same cardiovascular effort as running a marathon in a winter coat. Frontier wardens figured this out the hard way during the brutal summer months when inmates would simply drop dead in their tracks from heatstroke. Prisons back then were essentially massive masonry experiments with limited ventilation technology and no understanding of modern thermodynamics. Space was cramped, and administrators had to choose between building larger windows for air or keeping the bars narrow enough to prevent escape and maintain security. Most chose security, thinking they could figure out the health problems later, but that was a choice that led to thousands of preventable deaths from respiratory failure and heat exhaustion. Crews on pirate ships watched their water dwindle, but inmates in the West watched their own bodies wither from a lack of basic hydration and nutrition. Desperate prisoners would lick the condensation off the stone walls in the early morning, only to become violently ill from the mineral salts and bacteria trapped in the rock. Their muscles would cramp. Their skin would turn the color of sun-bleached leather, and their minds would begin to fracture into vivid hallucinations of mountain springs. Some reported seeing entire rivers flowing through the center of their cells, a phenomenon known as the desert's cruelest joke that signaled the final stages of dehydration. The smart wardens quickly learned that a dying inmate was a useless one, as the cost of replacing laborers was higher than the cost of keeping them barely alive. Stories spread through every territory about prison yards found littered with men who had simply stopped moving, their hearts giving out under the strain of the relentless Arizona sun. These weren't just cautionary tales about crime. They were a grim reality of how the environment could destroy a man faster than any hangman's noose. Proper ventilation became more valuable than gold bars, because it meant the difference between a functional workforce and a graveyard full of expensive masonry. Seriously, prisoners would guard their tiny scraps of shade like hidden treasure Because that square foot of cooler ground was exactly what it was, when the heat reached its peak, even the most hardened outlaws would turn submissive, trading their last possessions for an extra cup of lukewarm, alkaline water. Riots started over the distribution of water rations more often than they did over unfair sentencing or physical abuse by the guards. Legendary outlaws once said their biggest fear wasn't the marshal's bullet, but the prospect of spending 3 days in the dark cell with zero air during a July heat wave. But here is where the inmates and wardens got creative, developing tricks that would make modern HVAC engineers stop and take notice of their primitive brilliance. After learning that the desert was essentially a giant furnace, the architects of these prisons had to get innovative fast to prevent total catastrophe. Their first instinct was to pray for a cool breeze, but you couldn't just wait for nature to provide relief when men were dying every hour. Smart administrators rigged up elaborate air cooling systems using whatever they had available on the frontier, turning the prison's own architecture into a giant, passive cooling machine. Thick stone walls and narrow corridors became giant air ducts, stretched tight to funnel any slight movement of the atmosphere through the cell blocks. The trick was positioning the openings just right, so that the cooler air from the ground level would be pulled upward as the hot air rose toward the ceiling. It makes sense, right? But here is where it gets interesting. The wardens discovered that using dry stone was like trying to cool a room with a heated brick. So they developed a wetting routine, drenching the exterior of the buildings with water every morning to create a massive evaporative cooling effect. This meant precious water and manual labor were spent on preparation, but it was worth it to drop the internal temperature by even 5 degrees. Then there were the wind towers, improvised structures built from scrap wood and canvas that acted as giant scoops for the wind. These makeshift systems could catch the slightest breeze from the surrounding plains and funnel it straight down into the underground dungeons. Some prisons got so good at this that they could maintain a temperature nearly 20 degrees lower than the outside desert, creating a strange, cool sanctuary inside a literal hellscape. But wait, it gets weirder. When the wind wasn't blowing, desperate wardens turned to subterranean engineering. They would dig deep shafts into the earth, sometimes 50 feet down, to reach the naturally cooler soil layers beneath the surface. Come morning, they would open the vents to these shafts, allowing the cold air from the depths to flow upward into the main cell blocks. The amount of air was tiny, maybe just a few cubic feet per minute, but every breath of cool oxygen counted when you were suffocating in the stagnant heat of a high desert summer. The real problem with these methods was that the desert doesn't follow a prison schedule, and the heat could remain stubbornly high for weeks. Underground shafts could go dry, and the sun could evaporate the moisture from the stone walls faster than the guards could replenish it. Well, clever inmates started combining techniques, using wet blankets hung over their cell doors to catch whatever air was moving through the corridors. The most successful prisoners treated their personal cooling like a survival operation, timing their movements and breaths to minimize their own internal heat production. And the weird part is, these early methods actually worked pretty well when the conditions were right and the discipline was maintained. Inmates could survive even the most brutal heat waves if they followed the strict protocols of shade and hydration established by the prison's elders. But relying solely on architecture meant gambling with the lives of every prisoner behind those walls. Unfortunately, Mother Nature didn't always cooperate, forcing the prison administration to seek more reliable chemical solutions. They needed something that didn't depend on the wind or the humidity, something they could control themselves even when the sky stayed clear for months. You might think they had solved their survival problems once they managed the heat. But storing the inmates was a nightmare, wrapped in stone and sealed with false hope. Every territorial prison carried the risk of massive outbreaks of disease that could wipe out 100 men in a single weekend. These weren't your typical frontier illnesses either. We are talking about virulent, fast-moving infections that turned a cell into a biohazard. Bacteria and parasites absolutely loved these dark, moist stone homes and threw parties that would make your stomach turn inside out. Water sitting in open cisterns didn't just stay water for long. The dust and waste of the prison yard would turn it into a foul-smelling mess. Inmates noticed that their water supply would pick up hints of whatever lived in the soil around the prison, turning clear liquid into a toxic soup. One day you are drinking water that tastes like iron and dirt, and the next it has notes of rancid waste and decay that signal an impending epidemic of cholera. It makes sense, right? Stone absorbs everything like a thirsty sponge, and the porous granite of the cells held the sweat and illness of every man who had lived there before. Inmates discovered the hard way that their carefully rationed water would turn into a lethal poison within days in the sweltering heat. The irony was brutal. You could survive the hangman, the heat, and the thirst, only to die from a single cup of liquid that looked perfectly clear to the naked eye. Well, desperate times called for desperate measures, and the cowboys behind bars weren't known for giving up easily. They started experimenting, trying anything that might keep their environment from turning into a science experiment gone wrong. Some inmates tried adding crushed limestone or lime wash to the walls of their cells, hoping it would burn away the bad air and the invisible rot. Others rotated their sleeping positions, constantly moving their bedding to prevent any one area from becoming too saturated with filth. But these were just temporary fixes for a problem that demanded real, industrial-scale solutions. And the weird part is, the answer was literally staring them in the face every time they looked at the prison's cleaning supplies. The solution involved fire, chemistry, and a technique that would accidentally revolutionize how we think about modern sanitation today. Prisoners were about to become accidental scientists, and their next discovery would change the engineering of confinement forever. When your cellmates are dying of fever and your water tastes like rotting meat, you get creative fast with the materials at hand. Some clever warden or inmate figured out that high alkaline lime, the kind used for mortar, could actually save the entire population from a catastrophic plague. They started deliberately coating the interior of the stone cells with thick layers of white lime wash before allowing new prisoners to enter. Sounds like a simple painting job? Well, this whitewashing trick was pure genius disguised as aesthetic maintenance. The process was simple but brilliant. Guards would mix quicklime with water, creating a highly caustic alkaline solution that they would slap onto every inch of the prison's interior. They would let the chemical reaction sizzle and burn against the stone, effectively sterilizing the environment and killing any microbes lurking in the crevices. And the weird part is, it actually worked. That white layer wasn't just decoration. It acted like nature's own antimicrobial shield. The caustic surface grabbed onto nasty particles and bacteria that made the prison air go bad quickly, neutralizing them before they could infect the next man. Think of it as the world's first large-scale chemical disinfection system, invented by guys who lived in dirt and spent their days breaking rocks. Inmates noticed their lime-wash cells stayed cleaner longer and smelled less like a swamp, even after weeks of confinement. The white walls didn't just trap the bad stuff. They actually reflected the light, making the tiny cells feel brighter and reducing the psychological toll of the darkness. What makes this even more amazing is that cowboys accidentally stumbled onto something we still use in medical and agricultural settings today. Modern sanitation experts use similar alkaline treatments to manage waste because that high pH level makes it impossible for most harmful pathogens to thrive. Cowboys weren't trying to advance science, they just wanted a room that wouldn't kill them with a hidden infection. The lime wash method spread quickly through the territorial system because it actually saved lives and lowered the overhead costs of the prison. Word travels fast when you find something that keeps your workforce from dying of the bloody flux or mysterious camp fevers. Wardens started ordering their men to whitewash every cell every single month, regardless of whether it looked dirty or not. But even this clever trick had its limits. Lime couldn't work miracles on water that was already contaminated, and the process itself required a steady supply of caustic chemicals. Inmates needed backup plans for when the lime wash wasn't enough to keep the invisible killers at bay. Then there is something even more surprising that cowboys discovered about keeping their limited resources fresh and usable. They found that adding certain metals or plant extracts to their shared water buckets created results that seemed almost magical to the uneducated mind. While wardens were busy painting walls white, some clever inmates were busy tossing copper scraps or charred wood into their drinking supplies to fight off the internal rot. It wasn't just superstition. It was accidental genius that kept the prison population from collapsing under the weight of its own waste. Some prisoners noticed that water kept in copper vessels stayed clearer and sweeter for much longer than water kept in wooden buckets or stone jars. Those shiny copper bits weren't there for luck. They were there for survival, acting as a primitive but effective antimicrobial agent. Here is what happened. The copper ions would mess with the bacterial cell walls, basically destroying the tiny bugs before they could multiply and cause an outbreak. Cowboys stumbled onto this centuries before anyone really understood that germs existed as the primary cause of disease. They just knew their water lasted longer when metal sat at the bottom of the bucket, providing a tiny bit of protection against the stagnant heat. But here is the weird part. Some inmates swore that adding a bit of charred wood from the prison's cook fire made the water taste better and prevented stomach aches. They were accidentally creating a charcoal filtration system, using the porous carbon to absorb the toxins and impurities that had seeped into their supply. The charred wood didn't just trap the bad stuff, it actually improved the clarity of the water, making it look less like pond scum and more like something a human could actually swallow. What makes this even more amazing is that pirates and desert prisoners were using the exact same principles of carbon filtration to solve the exact same problem. Modern water filters still use activated charcoal for the same reasons, filtering out impurities and adding a level of safety to our drinking water. Not bad for guys who thought a bath once a month was a luxury they couldn't afford. Of course, charcoal and copper weren't perfect. They couldn't fix water that was already completely rotten or contaminated with heavy metals. It worked best as prevention, not a cure, which meant you had to be proactive with your hygiene from the very first day of your sentence. Smart inmates learned to add their protection to fresh water immediately, not wait until the smell started brewing in the corner of the cell. The charcoal trick spread through the prison system faster than gossip about a successful jailbreak or a hidden stash of tobacco in the laundry. Wardens who ignored these methods often found themselves dealing with sick crews and mutinous prisoners, demanding better living conditions. But even charcoal had its limits when the food supply ran dangerously low and the quality of the rations became a life-or-death issue. That is when prisoners needed something more dramatic than just metal and wood to keep their bodies from failing them during long years of hard labor. While charcoal and lime helped keep the environment fresh, cowboys still faced their biggest nightmare: the iron bean diet and the rot of the prison kitchen. Being surrounded by a desert meant you couldn't just grow fresh vegetables or hunt for clean meat to supplement your meager rations. That is when the craftiest inmates turned to what sounds like pure alchemy, turning moldy bread and dry beans into life-saving nutrients. The process involved fermentation and a deep understanding of how to use heat to neutralize the toxins found in spoiled food. It wasn't about making a fancy meal, though a good taste was probably a nice side effect that kept the men from losing their minds entirely. Inmates had to get creative with the limited heat sources in the prison yard, using sun-heated rocks or small, controlled fires to recook their rations. Boil the beans until they were mush, catch the rising steam if possible, and use the remaining liquid as a primitive broth that contained at least some caloric value. Simple in theory, but absolutely brutal in practice when you are working on a chain gang under the midday sun with limited fuel for a fire. Legendary prisoners actually ordered special cooking pots to be smuggled into the walls, knowing that the ability to process food was their only lifeline. Their fellow inmates thought they were crazy until they realized these contraptions could save their lives during the endless winters and scorching summers. The setup used iron pots heated over carefully guarded embers, with metal lids positioned to catch every scrap of heat and moisture. But this is where things became truly interesting and dangerous. These makeshift kitchens demanded constant attention, because any mistake could spark a prison fire. The inmates had to walk a fine line, keeping the flames hot enough to kill parasites in the meat, while not burning their own mattresses. Talk about high-stakes cooking. The fuel problem was massive too, as every piece of wood or dry grass was a precious commodity. Every scrap of material burned for cooking was material that couldn't be used for warmth during the freezing desert nights or for emergency repairs. Some inmates got so desperate, they started burning their own furniture, spare clothing, or even old boots, anything that would generate enough heat to boil water. The smell must have been absolutely terrible, a mix of burning leather and rancid fat that hung over the prison yard like a permanent cloud of misery. Then there is the speed issue that nobody talks about. These homemade food processing runs were incredibly slow and inefficient. We are talking about maybe a few edible servings per hour if you were lucky and had a good fire going. A hungry population of 200 prisoners needed massive amounts of calories daily just to survive the grueling labor in the rock quarries. Smart inmates learned to time their cooking runs perfectly, firing up their pots during the late afternoon when the sun had already preheated the stone surfaces of the prison yard. Some groups even took turns staying awake all night to keep the process running continuously, ensuring they had enough safe food for the next day's work. The iron pots they used often came from the prison's own smithy, repurposed from broken shackles or old wagon tires. Ironic that the tools of their confinement became the vessels of their survival. Prisoners discovered that iron worked better than other materials because it held the heat longer and stood up to the constant scrubbing required to keep the rot away. Of course, recooking spoiled food wasn't their only trick. When fuel ran low or guards became too suspicious, inmates had to get even more creative. They developed sun-jerky techniques that were surprisingly sophisticated, using the dry air to preserve whatever meat they could get their hands on. They would slice the meat thin, salt it heavily with whatever they could steal from the kitchen, and hang it in the direct sunlight for days. The heat would draw out the moisture, leaving behind a salty, tough strip of protein that would last for months without spoiling. Fresh air was even better, almost pure survival, just waiting to be captured and utilized to keep the body from decaying in the stagnant cells. These advanced methods separated the amateur criminals from the true survival experts who knew how to play the long game behind bars. While city boys worried about the length of their sentence, seasoned outlaws were mastering the laws of biology and physics without even knowing it. They turned their cells into floating laboratories of human endurance, where every experiment could mean the difference between seeing the sun again or dying in the dirt. The most successful cowboy prisoners weren't just good at fighting or riding. They were brilliant at staying alive through innovation, determination, and some seriously clever desert wizardry. They learned to respect the heat, the water, and the microscopic world around them, turning a death sentence into a masterclass in frontier engineering. In the end, the prisons of the Old West were more than just cages. They were the ultimate test of human ingenuity, where the stakes were as high as the desert sun, and the only way out was to outsmart the environment itself.